and more sustainable outcomes. Moreover, when conflict sensitivity is supported by peace-informed programming, we do see that climate action can be combined with socioeconomic co-benefits, leading to transformational changes in communities. Let me share an example from the CGIAR's work, in fact, the work of the International Potato Center in Haiti, where we implemented a project funded by the Agriculture and Agroforestry Technological Innovation Program, aimed at improving food security and nutrition, focusing on establishing seed systems for sweet potato, a resilient and nutritious crop. This is particularly crucial in Haiti, where challenges such as gang violence, political instability, and natural disasters are prevalent and act as severe challenges to food and nutritional security. In face of these challenges, maintaining high levels of flexibility and realism was essential to project success. Work plans were continuously adapted to account for unforeseen events and changing circumstances. When travel and face-to-face workshops became impossible, virtual training and online learning served as viable alternatives, ensuring continuity in project activities. Even the location of training events had to be altered to ensure the safety of participants and trainers, and the social media communication strategy was used to facilitate easy and rapid knowledge exchange. Innovative strategies and especially adaptive planning and implementation proved essential for us to successfully analyze and improve existing seed systems for sweet potato and establish new ones, thus contributing to agricultural development and broader humanitarian efforts. I'm glad to be able to say today that our project in Haiti is just one of many that are being implemented by the CGIAR and our partners, operating at the intersections between climate action, humanitarian programming, and peace and security. This panel today indeed takes place during an especially significant COP that saw the COP28 presidency supporting a climate relief, recovery, and peace declaration alongside the recent operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. The numerous side events and panels on the topic of climate security are also a sign of a growing and widespread interest in supporting the mobilization of funds toward fragile and conflict-affected settings. But as this interest grows, we also need adjustments in existing financial mechanisms and innovative solutions to implement projects. Today, as we will hear from our panel shortly, we have the pleasure to launch the Climate Security Programming Dashboard for Climate Finance, a CGIAR-led innovation developed by the CGIAR-focused climate security team with the support of Interpeace. The dashboard is an all-in-one tool for preliminary conflict-sensitive assessments and tailored guidance targeting projects funded by international financial institutions and climate funds. With greater awareness of conflict sensitivity and improved assessment tools available, more can be done. Ideally, all climate funds and IFIs will in future mainstream conflict sensitivity in their project cycle. However, we must follow a stepwise approach, acknowledging the political dimension of this intersection. Many multilateral climate funds lack the political mandate for conflict-sensitive or peace-responsive programming, and many states may disagree on the extent to which conflict and climate vulnerability are intertwined, and hence may be concerned about a potential securitization of climate finance. Given this reality, the first steps in our approach need to focus on common goals and shared commitments that are already the purview of the international community, such as improving access to climate finance overall and increasing the efficiency of financial allocations and implementation. Our session today will indeed be such a step in this direction. With this, I thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussions of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for so eloquently setting the scene for us. We are then going to invite the panelists on the stage, starting from Alisher Mamajnabov, Multilateral Governance Management at the Green Climate Fund. Our second panelist is Alona Baki, lead for climate, environment, science, and technology at USAID. Our third panelist is Abdi Majid Abdullahi, manager of Fragility and Resilience Division, Islamic Development Bank. And next, we have Al Hamdou Dorsuma, manager at the Climate and Green Growth Division of the African Development Bank. And finally, we have Daniel Heislop, head of research and senior peacebuilding advisor at Interpeace. Thank you. Daniel, sorry, do you mind if you sit here? Technical team told me I need to sit here. All right. Right. So yesterday, we saw the COP presidency announcing the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace, which was endorsed by more than 70 governments and 40 organizations. We need to start acting on these pledges and translate uh, pledges into action to mobilize funds for conflict-affected settings. So my first question will be to Alisher. Um, Yesterday, Mafalda Duarte, the executive director of the GCF, shared insights on the fund willingness to to take risk and collaborate with humanitarian actors. Yet in fragile and conflict-affected areas, directing climate finance is still proving very challenging. So my question was, how does the GCF encourage donors and accredited and direct access entities to take more risk, particularly in these sensitive settings? Thank you.
Thank you, Cesare. And would like also to greet all colleagues on the panel, but also all colleagues in the audience. It's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. Also, would like to congratulate you on the dashboard that is being launched. If you would allow, just would like to start with a few words about the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest multilateral climate fund. And we are an operating entity of the financial mechanism, both under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And within our mandate, we work to support developing countries in their low emission climate resilient development. And for us, as mandate, it was actually mandated by our governing instrument. We are committed to maintaining balance between mitigation and adaptation. And on top of that, which we actually have already reached, so 54% of all our funding, which is now reached $13.5 billion, our total committed funding by GCF, 54% of that in grant equivalent terms goes to adaptation. On top of that, and I think this is also quite relevant to the topic of this subject, we also pay attention to specific needs of particularly vulnerable to impacts of climate change countries, including LDCs, seeds, and African states. And right now, we have a floor allocation of 50% of adaptation to this category, but actually now 2/3 of all our adaptation funding goes to that category. And why I'm mentioning that is because when you compare the list of FCS countries, unfortunately, most of them are in that category, LDC seeds or African states. So we've been already working very closely in those countries. And coming, of course, to now to the main topic, and uh, obviously, like all major MDBs and IFIs and also climate funds, we also have our ESS standards, and actually we follow IFC performance standards in that sense. And of course, as you know, standard 4 already covers community health, safety, and security. So issues around conflict are already assessed and safeguarded within our normal project cycle. In terms of risk appetite, if we may call it this way, we have, of course, 3 levels of ESS safeguards, and then which we assess projects A, B, C. A, being, of course, the most um, that might have is the highest level where some mitigation measures may be necessary, and uh, those, of course, whenever the funding proposal comes, where some measures need to be taken, these are already assessed before the proposal is submitted. And I would like to give just also one example very quickly of a recently approved project in Haiti. It's a UNDP as accredited entity in the Trois-Rivières catchment. It's a project which will also build resilience and especially improve integrated flood management. So within that project, we went through, of course, all the necessary steps, taking into consideration the conditions of the country and specificities, which, of course, the project had an environmental and social management framework, which included fragility assessment, And at the local level, we also assessed all possible security risk and also mitigation measures were taken by our AE. And in addition, of course, the UNDP developed a security plan, including an assessment of potential security risks. So basically, of course, there is a two-way when you are working in such settings. First, you need to make sure that your project is not producing any additional security concerns, right? And then you also need to assess risk of how potential security risk is impact the project implementation and the outcomes that you would like to achieve as a result of this project. So I'll stop here. Also, maybe I already went above my time. Sorry for that.
No problem. Thank you very much, Alisher. It was very interesting to see again an example about Haiti and also to hear about do no harm practices in the GCF. Now, we would like to move to FDB approach. So, Alhamdou, specifically, how does the FDB tackle the challenges of absorptive capacity in fragile and conflict affected countries, ensuring that recipient countries are ready to host and implement projects in an effective and integrated way? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting the African Development Bank to this side event. Before I answer your question, let me first indicate that the recent climate vulnerability assessment has shown that most 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world are actually in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of them are in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Starting with my own country, Chad, which is actually on the top of that list. You have countries like Central African Republic, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia. You have other countries, DRC. Most of them are facing significant challenges regarding this insecurity, conflicts, fragility. And this has also been confirmed by the last year's IPCC report that has clearly suggested that Central Africa, West Africa, and East Africa are among the global hotspots when it comes to human security due to climate change. On top of that, those countries are facing significant challenges in accessing global climate funds. And there are reasons for that. You mentioned absorptive capacity, but there are underlying, actors, causes that explain this lack of absorptive capacity. The fragility and conflict situations are not clearly the criteria for accessing climate funds. So this is already an issue. When you want to access climate fund, look at the criteria. You cannot find this among those criteria. And there is also the fact that there is no dedicated window or sub-window within the existing global climate funds that address this issue of fragility and conflict situations. So countries, when they have needs, climate action needs, they don't know where to go. That they can find suitable mechanisms that can easily meet their requirements. So this is also a challenge that we see. Another issue I see is, of course, the limited capacities within the governments in the countries to develop funding proposals that can meet the existing criteria. And we see that already in global funds like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility. And I also want to mention that the fact that we are not well coordinated at country level. When I say we, I mean we, development institutions, humanitarian organizations, climate finance providers. How can we coordinate our efforts in order to specifically target the needs of those countries, which are different from the needs of other developing countries? Another issue I see is, of course, the complexity and high transaction costs of those climate funds. When I'm giving the example of the African Development Bank. When we put up 100 million project for a big country, let's say South Africa, or when we put a 10 million funding proposal for, let's say Niger, you have to use the same transaction costs. So sometimes it's easiest to go to this big ticket because you can leverage more instead of going for 10 million to address this a specific need of a fragile or conflict affected country. So I think this is also something that we need to address. And I think at country level also, I believe there is a need to prioritize climate finance because it is not yet part of the national planning process. You know, you have to plan for the next 5 years, for instance, at country level. You know, you have to have your own program. What is your programming approach as a country when you approach those climate funds? When you know that, for instance, for the JEF, countries have star allocations, and there is no plan behind how to use these allocations and use them in a strategic way in order to leverage additional resources. The same applies for the Green Climate Fund, etc. So prioritization, planning, I think I see that as main challenges. But if we are able to address those challenges, I'm sure the issue of absorptive capacity could be handled. And I believe, to conclude, that this should not be a constraint to deploy climate finance in those fragile and conflict affected settings. We need to change our approach. And I believe that when we go there, we need to understand that we are going to different settings. And we need to go there when we go to we provide funding for a specific project, we need to set aside funding to build capacity, provide technical assistance in order to address those structural challenges that I have mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful comments on lack of criteria and window opportunities for specific funding in financing in FCS, as well as lack of prioritization at the national level on climate finance. So building on these points, I would like to move to the Islamic Development Bank and ask Abdi Majid, in what ways does the IDB ensure that its projects are not only addressing development needs, but also contribute to peace building and social protection?
Thank you very much, and allow me to thank CGIAR for organizing this important session, which discusses an important, really, point. Second, I would like also to congratulate you for launching this significant operational tool that really help some of the practitioners to better design their programs and projects. For those of you who might not know Islamic Development Bank, we are a regional MDB based in Saudi Arabia with 57 member countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and also Europe. If you look at the challenge the Islamic Development Bank member countries are facing, is huge, particularly when it comes to fragility and conflict. We have the largest number of fragile and conflict affected countries. To give you an example, 31 of the 57 member countries of the bank members are fragile and conflict affected countries. 70% of the global humanitarian crisis occurs in our constituents. So this challenge is really huge, and it forces the bank to get out of its comfort zone, come out appropriate and adaptable tools that can help member countries to face this challenge. So in that regard, the bank has developed its first fragility and resilience policy, which is centered around mainly three main areas. First one is investing in prevention. We believe if we invest in prevention, we will be able to address the challenge that the member countries are facing when it comes to drivers of conflict and fragility. And according to the OECD, investing a dollar invested in prevention save is $17, not only also lives, but also assets. So we emphasize that our interventions are really addressing the drivers of conflict of fragility. And we do this through carrying out what we call fragility and resilience assessment, which has 6 dimensions. One of them is climate change, environment, and natural disasters. So often those countries that are, facing this challenge are our constituents, and countries we are talking about are member countries in Lake Chad region, as mentioned by previous colleagues from the African Development Bank, Horn of Africa, and also Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, which are prone to natural disasters and also compounding crises. So our aim is to ensure that our investments and interventions are not only addressing the drivers of fragility, but also helping these countries to manage the transition from conflict to development. The second approach that we have is that those countries are having some of them who have extreme fragilities that have been in the list of fragile countries for the last 15 years. And primarily, those countries are having active conflicts. So, what we do is our policy is to stay engaged, support them to manage the transition from conflict to recovery, and we do provide flagship programs that are tailored to address the issue of climate change. More recently, we realized that our practitioners and project officers, sector specialists, those who are operating on the ground, really need to have frameworks that can help them integrate conflict sensitivity and do no harm approach in the development programs and projects. So we first launched our first conflict sensitivity and do no harm approach, which is based mainly three principles. First one is ensuring country and local ownership, because without ownership, there is no sustainability. We ensure that any intervention that we are carrying out should be led by the local communities or the country that's going to benefit. Second is we ensure that our operational frameworks are really adaptable and flexible. Often those countries require not a rigid process, requires a flexible business processes, disbursement and procurement that can help them expedite the implementation and delivery of projects. So we ensure that our processes are as flexible as possible and as adaptable to the situation. And the second principle is based on contextual, because we cannot apply what happens in one country to another to ensure that our interventions are really addressing the needs of those countries. And we are closely working with local institutions that have the capacity to carry out the delivery of this implementation of projects. I will stop here and I will come back to the next question later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to see about the work you're doing on prevention, which really resonates with what we heard yesterday at the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace about anticipatory action. Now we heard from the funds, we move to humanitarians and peace builders. So we start with Alona. In the discussion we had, how does USAID tailor strategies to ensure effective delivery of climate finance in fragile and conflict-affected settings, especially considering the short-term imperatives of humanitarian action and the long-term timescale of climate action?
Okay, thank you, Cesare, and thank you for CGIAR for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here. So as mentioned before in this, Simon mentioned as well in his keynote, etc. I mean, it's a challenge, right? So it's a challenge that we deal with. I'm not going to hide that. And we deal with it in two ways. So one way is really adjustment to the financing itself. So and again, that was mentioned earlier, but so that is in a way, how can we increase risk appetite? But also the other part is also how can we reduce the risk? How can we, in a way, de-risk some of the possibilities? Some of that was really mentioned already in terms of course, acting in conflict and fragile affected areas in order to try and remove the drivers for these conflicts, etc. So we have, of course, big programs in democracy and peace building, etc. These are programs which we definitely emphasize also as part of our climate action. So, and the links between climate and conflict and how do we deal with that? Another part is really financing itself and collaborating with the private sector and seeing how can we de-risk some of the challenges. As part of that, during this COP, we're announcing the winners of the Prepare financing activity, which is the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, which was announced at COP by the US government. As part of that, we just announced the first round of winners for Prepare, and that specifically focuses on adaptation finance windows, also in conflict-prone areas, but developing countries at large. And we're already starting the new challenge, which is a climate finance development accelerator, which is going to de-risk specifically private sector approaches in climate adaptation in developing countries. As an example, I'd like to take, for example, one of the I'm going to just, so we can really dive into an example where we're working with MIT on development of specific MIT in collaboration with partnership with universities in the Middle East and North Africa in order to develop some climate-friendly approaches for increasing food security, so specifically reduced energy, reduced water, technology, etc. These kind of technologies, we're partnering both. USAID is financing some of the work and partnering with Toro company, which is going to finance the rest of the work. But really, USAID financing allows for Toro to actually implement that work. On a bigger scale, we can look at Jordan, for example, where they're planning, and USAID is playing a lead role in supporting the Jordanian government in developing the National Conveyance Project and supporting application leveraging from the Green Climate Fund towards this approach over $3 billion in order to support desalination, etc. In Yemen, one of the countries where we work closely with the Republican of Yemen controlled areas. We're improving collaborations on water conservation, climate conscious livelihood support, and provision of health services, which are really important. Maybe as part of the dealing maybe and de-risking climate finance in conflict-prone areas, I'd like to also mention our work that has to do with early warning systems. And that's one of the approaches that we look at, for example, drought early warning systems, an activity that we worked on with the International Water Management Institute, allows really both companies as well as farmers, the government, etc., try and predict what are the areas that are prone to more risk and how to go about really acting in these areas. And that's where I think the program that you're launching and the whole application is really going to play a big role. So thank you.
Thank you very much for providing a very interesting overview of the work you're doing with concrete examples. Now we move to Daniel. Drawing on the previous discussion, could you please expand on the peace-building dimension on and how IFI's climate and development actors can build a better partnership with peace actors to unlock climate action?
Sure. Thanks, Cesare, and thank you, panelists. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And I guess on behalf of Interpeace, thank you to CGIAR for your partnership over the past year to launch this tool that we'll be talking about later on trying to help climate funds become more conflict sensitive. Maybe I could just briefly add to, I think, Simon's very good introduction, where he cited a lot of the really important facts and figures of the link between climate and conflict. But the one number he didn't cite, and I've heard it several times at this COP already, is the flows that are actually getting to extremely fragile places. And the numbers are, it's about $2 per capita that's getting of climate finance that's getting to low income fragile settings versus 18 for non-fragile low income. So despite all the great efforts of all the partners here, at the moment, the fact is climate finance is not reaching places where it's arguably needed the most. And we sort of heard some things from Hamdou about what are the barriers. Maybe I could just add some of those barriers from a peace building point of view. I think when we're talking about adaptation mitigation, I think it's worth recounting that a lot of the things that we're talking about, whether it's changes to agriculture, changes to forestry, changes to livelihoods, in a lot of the places where we're talking about, where Interpeace, for instance, operates, these are inherently political questions, and they concern people, politics, communities. And the types of approaches that one needs to have in engaging in these places when you're working on these very sensitive dynamics is rather different to, say, other particular developed contexts. I think there's at least two reasons why multilateral climate finance is not getting to the fragile settings. And they're not dissimilar reasons why IFIs more broadly struggling with getting their resources to fragile settings. One, we know that a lot of IFIs and vertical climate funds, they operate in faraway capitals. They don't necessarily have local networks, capacities, skills on the ground where they operate. And so it's very important to try and connect those multilateral climate funds to local knowledge, local civil society, local peacebuilding approaches that can help bridge that gap. And I think the second issue is really around the fact that a lot of these institutions don't have proactive de-risking mechanisms. We talked a little bit about some of the risk approaches that, say, the GCF has. But what we're often, I think, requiring is more proactive de-risking, where we're actually trying to change the dynamics. It's not just about trying to avoid a bad thing from happening. And I think that's actually an important thing to state about conflict sensitivity. Conflict sensitivity is not just about not making the conflict worse. It's about trying to make positive contributions to the conflict dynamics. But you need special tools, capacities, skills, networks in order to do that. And civil society is a really key part to it. I just want to give one really quick example of work that Interpeace has done that might illustrate how this could work, how we think peace can come closer to climate finance. We've been working on an initiative called Finance for Peace for the past year, and we've been developing a peace bond that has a green characteristic, could be a green bond, around a solar project in northern Ghana. And that's a $50 million project. That project is in a conflict-affected setting. We've embedded into the use of proceeds a whole range of peacebuilding activities, participatory engagement, low-cost energy for some of the marginalized communities, community-level monitoring, political process with the local government, with the chieftains, with the regional government, and in trying to embed all that into the power purchase agreement. So being very intentional about how that particular solar project can really impact the peace dynamics in a positive way. And I think what's really interesting from the risk point of view is that in this feasibility study, which is a real project that's getting off the ground now, we're able to sell that project to investors. And those investors, instead of lending the $35 billion that's required to get this project off the ground at 19%, which is the country risk premium of Ghana, they are prepared to lend at a very modest, lower, and still very high, admittedly, 17%. That 2% improvement in the risk premium is created by the peace enhancing mechanisms. That improves the net present value of the project by about $6 million. So what you're actually trying to do in this particular model is de-risk the investment at the level of the asset, first for the communities, then for the investor. And you're really trying to align the incentives. So I think there's lots of other approaches that we could explore to really do this, and that's one particular example. But I think when we're talking about de-risking, it's important to de-risk for the communities, then de-risk for the investors. Too often we're actually just providing concessional finance to investors and not doing very much for the communities. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm doing something that probably shouldn't, but I think we're a bit running out of time. So I would change the run of show. And instead of doing a presentation of the toolkit itself, I'm just going to ask the technical team to put the homepage and leave it there. And I think it's more interesting if we discuss, and then later you will see a QR. You can take a photo of the toolkit, go on the website, play with it, and you will see by yourself. But basically, the toolkit provides a preliminary risk assessment and guidance. The risk assessment part can be used as a screening for operating entities in climate funds that are interested in basically assessing what's the potential for security and conflict risk in their projects, and therefore decide whether they want to invest in a conflict assessment. And action points and guidance can be seen as heuristic tools that help to think about how to integrate your projects with peace-sustaining co-benefits. So I would then do a quick round. Maybe let's keep it as short as we can, like 1 minute even each. And I would like to ask each of you, maybe starting from Alisher, what tools and solution in partnership like the one we see today, partnership from Interpeace and CGIAR, GCF is developing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesare. Just very quickly, also would like to follow up on the very interesting discussion we had. So in terms of what, in the light of the discussion, what will or might change in GCF? Right? So next year, the board may consider updating our ESS standards. So as I said, we were using IFC standards, but also next year, the board may consider revising them to tailor them more to GCF use, taking into account also all geographies where we work. And this may also include elements of conflict sensitivity. Also, very quickly, since we are now finalizing our second replenishment, and actually the good news we're pouring in, US 3 billion here from by Vice President Kamala Harris, and then also today actually 300 million euros from Italy. So, and with that we have now a record-breaking replenishment. So right now, as we speak, it's about $12.8 billion. So we want to produce impact with this money that's made available to us by contributor countries. And our ED, Mafalda Duarte, she has recently also unveiled her vision for GCF, 50 by 30, which means we would like to go at scale and by 2030 achieve a portfolio of GCF committed financing of $50 billion, which is managed in an impactful way, so to produce impact. And I would like to ask you to excuse me because, but I have a good excuse because next meeting I'm running to is about LDCs, and LDCs also have a lot of questions to GCF. So, so yeah, it's a UNFCCC LDC expert group, which is starting at 3. But I would like to thank you very much, all audience, CGIAR, and all colleagues on the panel. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure. Thank you for joining. Okay, thank you. All right, then I would like to follow with Alona again. Very quick, you mentioned some examples. Can you expand on those and tell us what are these concrete solutions that you are going to implement on conflict sensitivity? Thank you.
Of course, happily, and thank you. And first of all, I will say, so far, at least our first glimpse of the dashboard looks great. And it's something that can make a huge difference in our programs because we're generally advocating now for a systems change approach. So, you know, like in many humanitarian situations or development situations at large, we're looking at two scales of work, right? So we're looking at the immediate work and some specific projects, but we also are looking at going beyond programs and specific activities into a systems changed approach. And we do see in the dashboard itself, I think one of the areas that we really liked was the action points and guidance, which could definitely help and provide useful tools for designers and for other people in the implementation world in order to actually help us get some of the insights on our areas. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we can ask AFDB, Halamandu. Again, you mentioned before what the bank is doing, but can you provide us with some concrete solutions that you are going to implement or that you are in the process of implementing on conflict sensitivity?
All right, thank you. We have several solutions, but I'm wondering whether we could speak about that in 1 minute. But let me mention that actually we are implementing simultaneously 2 strategies. Our strategies for addressing fragility and building resilience in fragile contexts, and our climate change strategy for the next 10 years, which is prioritizing adaptation and resilience as well. So this is to tell you that we are applying both fragility and climate lenses to our operations, to our investments in Africa. Example, we do have what we have been implementing already, the Africa Development Fund, which has been there for 50 years. And the fund is supporting development interventions in the fragile and the conflict affected countries. 37 out of the 54 African countries are eligible to this fund. And we have committed that at least 40% of this fund is to be allocated to climate-related projects, climate-related interventions. That's something that we are already doing. And when we do allocate resources through the African Development Fund. As I said, we apply fragility lenses, meaning that when we do the analysis before allocating the funds, we do apply conflict sensitivity criteria and as well as climate vulnerability criterion. So these are things that we are already taking on board. And you may know that we have established not recently, a few years ago, what we call the transitional support facility, a dedicated fund to support several initiatives in fragile and conflict affected settings in Africa. So the TSF is already running. And recently, last year at COP27, we launched a new initiative on climate. We call it Climate Action Window. It's a new initiative to actually tie to the Africa Development Fund, which is already operating in fragile and conflict affected settings, but with a dedicated focus on climate, especially adaptation. And tomorrow we will be launching the first call for proposals for this new initiative. It's a 13 billion fund. We have been able to mobilize so far around 429 million that is going to be allocated to the first set of projects that will be announced in a few weeks. So to tell you that there are already several initiatives going on to meet the needs, the climate action needs of those countries that are very important in the as because they are these the client countries of the African Development Bank. We do also have several thematic funds that are available to countries in those countries, to those regions, especially the Sahel and the Eastern Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, too many solutions for 1 minute. We needed more time today. Abdi Majid, the IDB is a very specific group of member states, and we have very specific needs. Are there solutions specific to these needs that you are implementing?
Thank you very much. I think from after COP28, we are thinking also to operationalize the pledge that our president has made during the recovery, peace, and humanitarian launch yesterday, which is 1 billion for climate adaptation in specifically fragile and conflict affected countries. So this is one of area that we are really planning to push it and ensure that these countries have an access in terms of concessional and grant financing, because this is where they need really to have access to in order to address the issue of climate change. Second is to continue and operationalize the conflict sensitivity based approach, because what we believe is that our significant investment in infrastructure and also in different sectors need to be conflict sensitive and address the issue of drivers of fragility. So we'll continue that. What we are also planning to do that in light of the discussions and outcome of this exercise is to push fragility financing facility. We are thinking to introduce around 3.5 billion fund, primarily concessional and grants that will support fragile and conflict affected countries, particularly long-term resilience building. So what we are really thinking, not only focusing on humanitarian responses, but also ensure that we are addressing the HDP nexus, the humanitarian development peace nexus, in light of the challenge that those countries are facing, particularly a failed grants resources that can support those countries to access resources to achieve their national development plans. And I think such kind of tool that you have launched today will enable us to address the issue of prevention, because what we are all discussing is having preventative measures, but there are no indicative financing allocation like climate finance, for example. We have as a target 35% of the Islamic development finance to go to climate friendly projects. That's our target as an MDB. But we don't have a target when it comes to conflict prevention. This is, I think, where we need to work out. And I am sure CGIAR and other analytical, bodies will be able to come out tools that can help MDBs to iron out this gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Daniel, We already mentioned some of the solutions like the peace bonds and, of course, the climate security programming dashboard for climate finance. Do you want, I'm asking you, do you want to add more, or do we want to hear from the audience? What do you prefer? I think there is a lot of.
I'll put this over to everyone else. But put your hands up if you want to ask a question.
All right. Let's see, because we have only a few minutes, but it would be nice to maybe have a few questions from the audience, if there are any. Anyone? Yeah. All right. Let's do 1 and 2, and then okay. Can you?
Sorry, before I ask you, Daniel, you spoke about peace bonds. Are you the only ones doing peace bonds? Because I haven't heard about that as much before. So is that happening more widely? Do you see that in other institutions as well?
Right. I'm gonna get the other, and then we can answer.
It was great to hear about. My name is Ken Sofer from the International Rescue Committee. It was great to hear about all the efforts about trying to get more climate financing to fragile and conflict-affected states. I want to ask about how you ensure that gets not just to the states, but to the communities specifically that are conflict-affected, especially where states may not have complete control or access or the trust of those communities. And local civil society are a really big part of that. How do you ensure that financing you're delivering is accessible to local civil society, to women-led organizations, to women's rights organizations? Because the question is not whether we can get climate financing to Abuja in Nigeria, it's whether or not you can get it to Maiduguri in Nigeria.
Okay, Daniel, maybe you can pick the first then.
Yeah, I can try to quickly answer. No, so I mean, this idea of peace bonds is relatively new. Some are in train. We've developed a peace bond standard with a range of different actors to standardize this, which has been really key for the growth in the green bond market. There are going to be, hopefully early next year, some peace bonds issued. And this is a way of, I guess, capital markets being able to actually impact peace in a positive way. But all these things are connected, right? I think a lot of peace bonds could be applied to climate finance and to green finance, right? So we shouldn't necessarily think of them as different things, but it is about trying to make private investment much more intentional vis-a-vis the peace dynamics, as well as de-risking, right? It's not just about doing it because it's a nice thing to do. You do it because it'll actually de-risk your investment and you get all sorts of other reputational benefits. Maybe just to quickly answer the IRC question, which is, I think, a really important question. I think it's, this is about where we can get more blended approaches, right? Where it's not necessarily about, so it's trying to use grant-based finance with forms of, debt finance. And again, this is where a bond structure is very interesting, right? Because you can actually split, parts of that use of the proceeds to grants, parts of it to more bankable components. That's all in the financial structuring of how we go about it. I just want to say one quick thing about conflict sensitivity, which is this tool that we're launching is very much a public good, but conflict sensitivity, and we know this from our experience working with a lot of UN agencies on conflict sensitivity, unfortunately has become a bit of a box tick. And I think what's going to become very necessary is to engage these institutions into how they can be more participatory. How can they actually engage communities in a more inclusive way? And sometimes that may involve other actors, not these institutions, right? And so I think we need to be thinking about new partnerships that can actually make that happen. And that's one thing that I think Interpeace is very keen to do with AFDB. We've just launched the MOU. AFDB is, I think, one example of a regional development bank that's making really like quite impressive strides to become much more conflict sensitive and peace intentional in its operations.
Lorna.
Thank you. Yeah, so at USAID, we definitely emphasize localization and working with local communities, specifically with women and minority-led organizations, etc. One of the ways we do that is not only through our implementation, also in our strategy itself, right? So making sure that we have local communities and local actor be active part of our strategy building and strategy making, as well as our design. One place where, so I'm the lead for the Middle East Bureau, we can see in Morocco right now where there's specifically design and climate designs that are specifically integrating local communities also in remote areas and communities that are led by women and minority owned. So yeah, thank you.
Do you want just quickly, I think we do have at the African Development Bank a few financing mechanisms that are providing resources to local communities and NGOs. For instance, the Africa Climate Change Fund, which operates based on calls for proposals. So in our portfolio, we do have a lot of projects being managed by NGOs and local communities, as well as municipalities. We also launched what we call the Urban Development and Municipal Fund. This is targeting cities, especially cities, because we know that largely our funding as MDBs goes to countries, and we realize that we need to have specific windows for local communities, municipalities, NGOs. And the new initiative that I just mentioned, the climate action window, it is also operating based on call for proposal, because we know that we are not going just to provide funding to governments, but also to other non-state actors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question. From IDB point of view, what we do is we do work with local institutions. Actually, our aim is to empower national civil society organizations that are active in the respective countries. And the reason is wherever is access of state services is very limited, this organization is really play a very important role, particularly fragile and conflict affected countries where the state institutions are either non-existent or they don't have the capacity. So our role is to mainstream them in our main development programs and projects, particularly mega projects like infrastructure. When it comes to infrastructure energy projects, they have a very important role to play. Transport sector also, they play a very important role in terms of mitigating the risk of those projects. And in particular, we have designed and developed a dedicated flagship programs like Tadamun. Tadamun in Arabic is solidarity. So we have Tadamun community, where international NGOs, INGOs, civil society organizations can have an access, not only in terms of resources, but also wider network from Indonesia to Africa to Europe to Latin America. They are all interconnected and sharing their wealth experience in terms of addressing the challenge of climate change and other issues that is facing globally. So we do work with local organizations, and we really support and encourage other MDBs and other institutions to do the same.
Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you to all the audience, those connected online as well as those here, for having attended and asked a very insightful question. I also want to say thank you to CGIAR Clamber Initiative and Fragility Conflict Migration Initiative, which provided funding for the development of the climate security program in dashboard. And I really hope today's discussion is just one of the first that we will have on how to operationalize the December 4th declaration. And as Daniel was saying, avoiding to make conflict sensitivity a checkboxing exercise. Thank you.